She noticed him 6 months before she knew his name. Every morning. The same ferry. The same corner seat. A green notebook instead of a phone, and the particular way he looked at the water, not absently, but like it deserved to be looked at. She told herself it meant nothing. People share ferries. People share cities. You don't have to know someone, just because your eyes keep finding them in a crowd. And then one morning, her coffee ended up on the deck, his napkins ended up in her hand, and Leyla understood that some things you can ignore, for exactly as long as you're not paying attention. His name was Mert. He taught history and wrote in secret, and had never once sent a single page to a publisher. He lived in his parents' house, and crossed the Bosphorus every morning, and looked at Istanbul the way she had always wanted to feel about a place. Like it was his. Like he was its. She had a life here too. 7 years of it, carefully built. But she also had an email sitting unanswered in her inbox, a job offer, a different city, a version of herself that made more sense on paper. The question was never whether she could leave. The question was what she would be leaving. This is the woman who chose to stay.
A simple like helps this channel more than you know. So thank you for your support. I'm always curious to see where my listeners are from. Please drop a comment and share your location so I can see how far this story has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe, and now let's get back to the story.
There is a particular kind of morning that belongs only to Istanbul. It arrives before the sun has fully committed to the day, a grey, luminous hour when the Bosphorus holds the light like a secret, when the water is neither blue nor green, but some color that doesn't have a proper name in any of the 3 languages Leyla spoke fluently. The ferries begin their crossings in that hour, and the sound of them, low, resonant, the groan of engines and the press of water, is the sound she had come to think of as the city's heartbeat. She had lived in Üsküdar for 7 years. Long enough that she no longer noticed the view from the ferry the way visitors did, with their phones raised, their breath caught. Long enough that she had developed opinions about which seat on the upper deck caught the least wind in November, and which vendor near the Beşiktaş pier made the only simit worth eating before 8 in the morning. She had not, she would later admit, developed enough self-awareness to notice that she had begun to organize her mornings around someone she had never spoken to. That came later. That came the morning everything changed. The trouble began, as most of Leyla's troubles did, with time. She had overslept by 11 minutes, not catastrophically, but enough. She had dressed in the particular hurried way that leaves one nagging detail unresolved, the feeling that something is slightly wrong without being wrong enough to fix. In her case it was her hair. On any other morning she would have taken the 10 minutes required to pull it back into the neat, low knot she wore to work, professional, contained, not a strand out of place. This morning she had not taken the 10 minutes. Her hair was down, dark and thick, and she was already out the door before she fully registered the decision, the loose waves moving against her shoulders as she walked. She walked fast. She always walked fast, but this morning she walked with purpose, the kind that required other pedestrians to make small adjustments to their trajectories. The streets of Üsküdar were already busy, the tea houses open, the school children in their uniforms, the old men at the backgammon tables who seemed to have been there since the previous century, and would remain long after. She barely saw any of it. She was calculating, 3 minutes to the pier, 2 minutes for the gate, the ferry left at 8:20. She made it. Barely. The upper deck was crowded in the way it only was when the weather was cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not cold enough to drive people inside, everyone standing, slightly damp, slightly irritable, holding their coffees and their phones, and their particular morning grievances against the universe. She was making her way toward the railing when it happened. Someone moved suddenly to her left, she never quite saw who, never determined whether it was accident or intent, and she was jostled hard enough that the travel cup slipped from her hand. She reached for it and missed. What she caught instead was the railing, which was cold and wet and entirely unhelpful. The coffee hit the deck. She stood for a moment looking at it. A small, dark catastrophe spreading across the painted metal floor. Here. She looked up. The man was tall, she registered that first, and then the dark brown eyes, and then the fact that he was already holding out a small stack of paper napkins in that careful, slightly uncertain way of someone who isn't sure if the gesture is welcome, but has committed to it anyway. He had a notebook in one hand and the napkins in the other, and he looked, she thought, like someone who had acted on instinct and was only now catching up with himself. "I had extras," he said, in Turkish, and then added, in English, for reasons that were not immediately clear, from the simit. Leyla looked at the napkins. She looked at the spreading coffee. She looked back at him. "Thank you," she said, and took them. She cleaned what she could. He helped without being asked, crouching down to press napkins to the deck, and she noticed that he did it without any apparent self-consciousness about the absurdity of the situation. When it was more or less done, they both straightened up and stood for a moment in the particular silence of two people who had just shared an unexpectedly intimate task. "Leyla," she said. He blinked. Then seemed to understand. "Mert." They shook hands, which felt formal and slightly ridiculous given that they had just been kneeling together on a ferry deck, and then both of them registered the absurdity at the same moment, and something shifted, loosened, and it became easier. "I've seen you before," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the thing she didn't say aloud, standing there on the upper deck with the Bosphorus opening around them and the skyline of Istanbul rising on both sides. She had known his face for months before she knew his name. She had constructed, without meaning to, an entire silent portrait of him from ferry-length observations, the way he always took the same spot on the starboard side, the way he read from a worn notebook rather than a phone, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence and turned to look at the water, not absently, but with the focused stillness of someone checking something against the real thing. She had looked away the first time she'd caught him doing it, the way you look away from something too private to witness. She had not thought she would ever speak to him. "Sit," he offered, and gestured toward the bench along the railing, where two spaces had just opened. She looked at her empty coffee cup. She looked at the 15-minute crossing ahead of her. She sat. The ferry pulled away from the pier. The wind caught her hair and moved it across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand, an unfamiliar gesture, on a morning that was already full of them. The city slid past on both sides, and Leyla thought, well, all right then. By the time they reached Beşiktaş, she knew that he taught history at a primary school nearby, that he had lived his whole life on the Asian side in a house he'd inherited from his parents, and that he took the 8:20 ferry every morning because it was less crowded than the 8:40. He knew that she was a guide at Dolmabahçe Palace, that she spoke 3 languages, and that the coffee from the vendor near the Üsküdar pier was, in her opinion, the best on either side of the Bosphorus. "You've never been to Dolmabahçe," she said, as they reached the pier. She had just confirmed this, surprised by it. "I've never been to Dolmabahçe," he confirmed, without apparent shame. "You teach history." "I teach history." He smiled, that slow, warm thing that started somewhere behind his eyes before it reached his mouth. "I find old things more interesting in written form. Without the velvet ropes." She thought about the palace as she walked toward it each morning, the chandeliers, the parquet floors, the way the light came through the water-facing windows, in a way that made you feel briefly like you were standing somewhere outside of time. She had stopped really seeing it, she realized. She gave the same tour, the same words, in 3 languages, and the palace had become a script. "Maybe," she said, "you should see it anyway." He didn't answer immediately. He was already gathering his things, the notebook, a scarf he'd nearly left on the seat, a pen that had rolled under the bench, and required an undignified amount of crouching to retrieve. When he straightened up, he looked faintly pleased with himself for having recovered it. "Maybe I will," he said. They went in opposite directions. Leyla walked the familiar route to the palace and did not think about him. Or, she thought about him precisely as much as she was willing to admit to herself, which was not very much at all, which was still considerably more than she had expected. It was only later, walking back through Beşiktaş toward the evening ferry, the low autumn sun turning the water gold, the air carrying the smell of roasting chestnuts from a cart near the pier, that the memory surfaced, unbidden and precise. 6 months ago. Maybe more. She had been walking slowly, the way she only allowed herself to walk when the workday was finished, and there was no one watching her perform the role of competent professional. The pier was busy but not crowded, and she had arrived early enough to stand at the railing while she waited, watching the Asian shore across the water. That was when she had seen him for the first time, or rather, that was when she had actually looked. He was standing near the edge of the pier, a little apart from the other commuters. Everyone else was on their phone or talking, or watching the gate for when it would open. He was just standing there with his hands in his pockets, watching the water with an attention that had nothing distracted in it, as though the light on the surface, and the slow movement of a distant tanker were things worth the full weight of his presence. She had thought, who does that? She hadn't approached him. Of course she hadn't. She'd gotten on the ferry and found her usual spot and opened her book, and at some point she'd looked up and he was sitting in the corner with his notebook and a small, private smile at something he'd just written. She'd looked back down at her page. She hadn't thought of it as the beginning of anything. She'd thought of it as a moment, one of those small urban details that you collect and then misplace. But she hadn't misplaced it. She'd carried it all these months, apparently, without knowing she was carrying it. And now, walking toward the evening ferry with the chestnuts roasting, and the Bosphorus going gold, she understood that she had been aware of him long before this morning, that her eyes had learned to find him in a crowd before she'd given them permission to do so. The next morning she arrived at the pier 3 minutes early. She did not acknowledge to herself that this was unusual. He was already there, in his usual spot on the starboard side, the notebook open on his knee. He saw her before she reached him. She caught the precise moment of recognition in his face, that small recalibration, and moved his bag to make room. "Coffee?" he said, gesturing to the cup he'd apparently bought at the pier. "I have my own," she said, and held up her travel cup, a different one, with a lid that actually closed. He nodded seriously. Structurally improved. She sat down. The ferry moved. They talked. It was easy, which surprised her. She was not someone people found easy. She knew this about herself without bitterness. She had what her German friends in Düsseldorf had called unnahbar, unapproachable, though she had always thought the problem was less that she was unapproachable, and more that people assumed her stillness was coldness when it was simply attention. She listened closely. She didn't fill the silence with noise. This made some people uncomfortable. Mert didn't seem uncomfortable. Mert seemed to find the silences as interesting as the conversation, which was either a very good sign, or an indication that he was not paying attention. Within 2 mornings she had determined it was the former. He was paying close attention. He just didn't feel compelled to perform it. They talked about Istanbul. This was, she discovered, a subject on which he was both inexhaustible and genuinely interesting, not the tourists' Istanbul, not the expats' Istanbul, but the city as a living palimpsest, layers of civilization pressing up through the modern surface in unexpected places. He talked about Byzantine cisterns beneath shopping streets, about the way the neighborhoods shifted character every few hundred meters, about the Ottoman poetry that had been composed looking at this same stretch of water they crossed every morning. "You love this city," she said one morning, as a statement, and also, she realized too late, as a question. He considered it. "I don't know if love is the right word," he said. "It's more like, I can't fully imagine being someone who isn't from here. The city is part of how I think." She looked at the water. On the European side, the palace was just visible in the distance, its white facade catching the early light. "I envy that," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to, and she was grateful for both of those things. She had learned, in 7 years, to love Istanbul the way you love someone else's home, with appreciation and genuine warmth and the constant faint awareness that you could, at any point, be asked to leave. She had not grown up here. She had grown up in apartments in Düsseldorf and once, briefly, Berlin, her mother German, efficient, precise in her emotions, her father Turkish, warm and loud and always slightly homesick, and the two of them together a negotiation that had been ongoing for her entire childhood, two different ways of being in the world trying to coexist in a series of moderately sized European flats. She had loved them both. She had also spent most of her childhood translating between them, not just linguistically. Her German was her mother's, her Turkish her father's, and she had learned early that language was never just language, but emotionally, culturally, in all the ways that a child of two worlds becomes an interpreter for both, without ever quite belonging to either. When she was 18, she had come to Istanbul for university. Her father's city, her father's language, but also somewhere new enough that she could be, for the first time, simply herself rather than the product of two competing gravitational fields. She had stayed. She had made a life here, the apartment in Üsküdar, the job at the palace, the morning ferry, the particular rhythms of a city that never quite slept and never quite fully woke. She loved it with the love of someone who had chosen it deliberately. But choosing a place was not the same as being from it. She understood that difference every time someone asked where she was from, and she had to decide which answer to give. She noticed, around the third week, that she had begun to watch for the notebook. Not because she intended to ask about it, she wasn't sure she had the right, but because it was the most interesting thing about him, and she had spent enough time in its vicinity to have formed opinions. It was a Leuchtturm, dark green, worn at the corners. He wrote in it with a specific pen, the same pen he'd retrieved from under the ferry bench on their first morning, which meant he was attached to it, which meant what was inside mattered to him. He never read from it aloud. He occasionally laughed at something he'd written, quietly, with the private satisfaction of someone who has surprised themselves. She admitted to herself one evening, curious in a way that felt disproportionate. On a Thursday morning in November, the ferry was delayed, some mechanical issue with the gate, the announcement said, 20 minutes minimum. The upper deck acquired a particular resigned quality. People put their phones away. Some looked at the water. Some looked at nothing. Mert closed the notebook and looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He waited. "What do you write?" A pause. Long enough to be meaningful. "Notes," he said. She held his gaze. He looked out at the water. Looked back. Made a decision she watched him make. He opened the notebook and held it out to her. She read. The ferry rocked gently against the pier. Around them the morning went on, conversations, coffee cups, the distant sound of a tanker's horn, and she was entirely elsewhere, inside the pages. It was prose, dense and precise and strange in the best way, about the city and memory and the particular kind of grief you feel for places that are changing, and the way water holds light differently depending on what you need it to hold. It was not what she had expected. It was considerably better than what she had expected. She looked up. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone trying to read a verdict in a face. "Why haven't you sent this to anyone?" she said. He took the notebook back, closed it with a care that answered the question before he did. "Because if I send it and they say no, it's finished," he said. "It stops being the thing I'm working on and becomes the thing that didn't work." He paused. "While it's still just mine, it can still be anything." Leyla was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. "That logic." "Do you?" She thought of the job offers she hadn't applied for. The apartment she'd told herself she'd find eventually, somewhere she actually wanted to stay long term. The decision to remain in Istanbul, that she remade every year without ever quite making it permanent. "More than I'd like to," she said. The gate opened. The ferry loaded. They crossed the Bosphorus with the November sky low and silver overhead, and they didn't talk much for the rest of the crossing, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The kind that means something has been placed between two people and acknowledged, even if not yet named. They had coffee outside of the ferry for the first time on a Friday afternoon. He had appeared at the Beşiktaş pier at 5 o'clock in the way of someone who happened to be there, which Leyla recognized as the male tendency to appear to have arrived at things casually, when in fact they had planned it, and she found this mildly charming. "I was nearby," he said. "You work in Beşiktaş," she said. "Yes," he said. They went to a small place he knew, around the corner from the pier, where the tea came in tulip-shaped glasses, and the windows looked out on the passing street. She ordered tea. He ordered tea and, without consulting her, a plate of baklava that arrived glistening and precise, and they ate methodically, while he talked about a book he was reading about the Byzantine Empire's fall, which turned out to be fascinating in a way she hadn't anticipated. She told him, for the first time, about growing up between two languages. German mother, she said. Turkish father. Very different people who loved each other very much, and spent my childhood arguing about how to load a dishwasher. He smiled. "Is that a metaphor?" "The dishwasher was a metaphor," she said. "Also a dishwasher. And Istanbul was mine," she said, simply. "Here I didn't have to be half of anything. I could just be." He nodded slowly. Outside, a cat crossed the window at a brisk, purposeful trot, and two pigeons dispersed and resettled, and the Friday afternoon crowd shifted around them, and Leyla thought, "I have not said that out loud before. Not to anyone here. Not quite like that. Does it still feel that way?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Most mornings," she said. 3 weeks later, she arranged for him to visit Dolmabahçe after hours. It wasn't difficult, a word with the right colleague, a favor she was owed. But she hadn't done it before for anyone, and she was aware of this as she waited for him at the side entrance at 5 o'clock on a Thursday evening, after the last tour group had gone, and the palace had fallen into its after-hours quiet. He arrived exactly on time, which she appreciated, and he looked at the building the way she had hoped he would, the way she had forgotten to look at it herself, with genuine, unself-conscious awe. "For scale," he said, standing in the central hall and looking up at the chandelier, 4 tons of Bohemian crystal. She had said this sentence so many times it had lost all weight, and he made it heavy again by the way he stood beneath it. She watched him instead of the palace. He moved through the rooms the way he moved through conversations, unhurried, attentive, stopping at things that weren't necessarily what you were supposed to stop at. Not the famous rooms, not the ceremonial spaces. The windows. The views of the water. The places where you could feel the geography pressing in. Abdülmecid wanted this to belong to both worlds, she said, standing beside him at a window that looked out over the Bosphorus. Across the strait, the lights of the Asian shore were beginning to come on, one by one, as the evening settled over Üsküdar. He wanted it to say, "We are Eastern and Western both, we are neither lesser nor other." Did it work? Mert asked. Historians disagree. She paused. "I think the building knows what it is. Whether anyone else believed it was a separate question." He turned to look at her. She felt, rather than saw, the quality of his attention shift. "Is that what you think about yourself?" he said. Not cruelly, with genuine curiosity, the kind she had learned to recognize in him, the kind that didn't require an answer if she didn't have one. She looked at the water instead of at him. The lights of a tanker moved slowly north. "I think I know what I am," she said finally. "I'm still deciding where that is." Beside her, she felt him turn back to the window. Their arms were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her coat. Neither of them moved. Below, the Bosphorus moved through its ancient channel, indifferent and continuous. November became December. The mornings grew colder, and the ferry crossings took on a different quality, the sky darker at 8:20, the water harder, everyone slightly more braced against the world. Leyla bought a new coat. Mert appeared one morning with a knit hat pulled down to his eyebrows, that should have looked ridiculous and somehow didn't. Nice hat, she said. My mother made it, he said, entirely serious. She pressed her lips together and did not smile, as a courtesy. The mornings were hers in a way that had become so natural, she couldn't quite reconstruct how the previous ones had felt, before she'd had someone to sit with, someone to talk to, someone whose presence organized the crossing into something with a beginning, and a middle and an end. She was aware that this dependency had developed without her supervision, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the awareness. She filed it, as she filed most things that made her uncertain, in the place where she kept things she would examine later. Later had a way of not arriving. One morning she said, "You should send it." He didn't ask what she meant. They had talked around the notebook often enough, that there was no ambiguity. "It's not finished," he said. "It never will be," she said. "That's not how it works." "You don't know that." "I do know that." She turned to face him. The wind off the water was sharp, and she had to hold her coat closed with one hand. "You said yourself, as long as it's yours it can be anything." "But Mert," she stopped. Started again. "The reason it can be anything, is also the reason it never becomes something actual. At some point you have to let it be what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look. "If they say no," he began. "Then they say no," she said. "And it's still what it is. Their opinion of it doesn't change what you put into it." Another long pause. The ferry was pulling into Beşiktaş. The city rose around them. "I'll think about it," he said. "You've been thinking about it," she said. He sighed in the way of a man who has lost an argument, and is making peace with it. "I'll do it," he said. He sent it on a Sunday evening. The acknowledgement email came Monday morning. He saw it when he checked his phone between classes. He spent the rest of the day carrying that knowledge quietly in his chest, and that evening, when he got home, he called her. He sounded like a man who had either done something very brave, or very stupid, and hadn't yet determined which. "And?" she said. "And nothing. I sent it and then I turned my phone face down and watched football." He paused. "I don't even like football." She laughed, really laughed, the kind that arrived before she could organize it, and she could hear him smile on the other end of the line. "How long does it take?" she asked. The actual response, "Weeks, apparently. Months." "Then we wait," she said. She had said. She registered it at the same time he did, in the slight stillness that followed. She didn't correct it. She called her father that week. This was not unusual. She called him every week, sometimes twice, in a Turkish that was slightly more formal than his because she had learned it in classrooms rather than kitchens, and he always called her out on it, and she always told him to mind his own business, and they both considered this a successful phone call. What was unusual was that afterward, her mother called. Her mother called on birthdays and at Christmas, and when something was wrong. Nothing was wrong, her mother said. She had simply seen a job posting, she had sent the link already, had Leyla checked her email? That seemed very well suited to Leyla's profile. Cultural liaison position with a tourism development company, based in Berlin. Languages required, English, German, Turkish. Strong preference for candidates with expertise in Ottoman history. "It's made for you," her mother said. "Mama," Leyla said. "I'm only saying. You could look." After she hung up, Leyla sat in her kitchen in Üsküdar, and looked at the email with the link in it for a long time. Her mother's city. Her mother's language, her mother's practicality, you could have stability, you could have a career, you could have a life that makes sense from the outside. Her mother had never quite understood why Leyla had stayed in Istanbul, had never quite believed that the reason was as simple as Leyla said it was, which was, because here I am only one thing, and that thing is myself. She thought of what she had said to Mert at the palace window. "I'm still deciding where that is." She opened her laptop. She looked at the job description. She closed the laptop. She did not answer the email. Mother always knew how to find her in the moment Istanbul was beginning to feel like home, she thought, in her father's Turkish, a thought that had no good equivalent in either of her other languages, which was itself a kind of answer. January arrived with rain. Mert received an email from the publisher in the second week, a response, not a rejection, a request for the full manuscript, and a call with an editor in Ankara. He told her on the ferry, and she could see him trying to stay calm about it, and failing in the best way. The particular barely contained aliveness of someone receiving news they had told themselves not to expect. The full manuscript, she repeated. They want the full manuscript. Mert. I know. I know. He was looking out at the water, smiling at something invisible. I know. She watched him. Something shifted in her chest. She would not have called it tenderness, if you'd asked her, because she was not in the habit of naming things like that, but she held onto the word anyway, privately. He began working on revisions. This was, she discovered, what Mert looked like when fully occupied, slightly elsewhere, apologetically present, arriving at the ferry with the notebook already open, texting occasionally at times he previously wouldn't have, an email always half composed in his mind. He was still there. He was also, incrementally, somewhere else. She told herself this was normal. Of course it was normal. She would have been alarmed if a person received this kind of opportunity, and remained unchanged by it. She told herself this on the ferry one February morning, watching him type quickly on his phone, and then put it away with the slight guilt of someone remembering where they are. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. She meant it. She also noticed that the crossing had felt longer than usual. The evening she received the formal offer letter, her mother, it turned out, had contacted someone she knew at the company, which was exactly like her mother. Leyla sat with it open on her screen for 40 minutes before she did anything. The offer was good. It was, objectively speaking, a better situation than the one she was in, more money, professional growth, cultural work she would find genuinely meaningful, in a city where she had family, and a language that was half hers and a life she could, probably, build. The kind of stability that looked like adulthood from the outside. She thought, I should tell Mert. She thought, I should tell him the way I'd tell anyone about a job offer. As information. She thought, if I tell him as information, I will have already made the decision. She didn't tell him that week. She told herself she was still deciding. She told him on a Tuesday morning. Cold, clear, the sky that particular winter blue that made the city look like a painting of itself. My mother sent me a job offer, she said. In Berlin. He looked at her. What kind of job? She described it. He listened. She watched him process it. His face did the thing it did, which was to become very still when he was thinking carefully about something. That sounds like a good opportunity, he said. It is, she said. Will you apply? She looked at the water. I haven't decided, she said. A pause. Then he said, Leyla, and stopped. She waited. I think, he said slowly, that you should do what's right for you. A beat. I mean that. I'm not just saying it. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and she saw that he did mean it, and she also saw the thing underneath it that he wasn't saying, that he was choosing not to say because he had decided it wasn't his to say. She wanted, quite suddenly and inconveniently, to shake him. I know you mean it, she said, and her voice came out more clipped than she intended. The ferry docked. They walked off together and then in different directions, and the morning went on, and Leyla arrived at the palace and gave 3 tours in 3 languages, and each time she talked about Abdülmecid and his palace caught between worlds, she felt the echo of it in a way that was no longer useful, or interesting but simply uncomfortable. She took the long way to the pier that afternoon. A different route than usual, past the fish market and the old hammam, down through streets where the buildings were narrow and old, and the laundry hung between windows like the remnants of conversations. She had walked these streets hundreds of times. She was looking at them differently today. She understood, trying to feel something conclusive about staying. It didn't work. Places don't perform for you when you demand it of them. She took the 6 o'clock ferry. He wasn't on it. Some evenings their schedules simply didn't align, and this was one of them. She sat in their usual spot, and looked at the Asian shore coming toward her, and tried to imagine not doing this. Not this crossing. Not this view. Not the sound of the engine, and the weight of the water, and the particular specific quality of this between place, neither European nor Asian, neither sky nor sea, moving. She went home. She did not answer the email. The following week she rearranged what she could. She told herself it was scheduling. She had late tour groups one day, an early training session with a group of tourism students another. It was not entirely a lie. But she also took the 8:40 on 2 mornings when she could have taken the 8:20, and she knew why she was doing it, and she was not proud of it. Avoiding something is not a decision. She knew this. She had always known this. She had simply not previously found herself unable to stop. She was on her way home one Wednesday evening when she slowed, without meaning to, at the Beşiktaş pier. Not her pier, she was going home, which meant Üsküdar, which meant the other side, but something in her feet made the decision before her mind caught up, and she stopped at the railing and looked at the water. It was dark and it was winter, and the lights of the bridges were reflected in long, wavering columns, and the tankers moved slowly north toward the Black Sea, and on the other side, the Asian shore glittered with its ordinary Wednesday evening life. Somewhere among those lights was Üsküdar. Somewhere among those lights was home. She stood there for a while, just looking. She got on the next ferry. She found her seat. She crossed the Bosphorus in the direction of home, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its simplicity, I don't want to leave this. Not Istanbul. Not the ferry. Not the specific gravitational field she had allowed, without quite admitting it, to organize her mornings. I don't want to leave this, and I've been pretending the decision isn't already made, because the decision being made means something, and what it means is frightening. The ferry docked at Üsküdar. She walked home. She did not answer the email. She saw him on a Saturday morning at the Üsküdar market. She was buying dried figs from a vendor she had been buying dried figs from for 5 years, and she turned around and he was there, which was either coincidence or fate, or simply the inevitable consequence of 2 people living in the same neighborhood, and shopping on the same day, depending on how romantic you were feeling. He looked surprised to see her. Then not surprised. Then careful, in the way he'd been careful since the Berlin conversation, present but not pushing, there but not demanding. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. He was carrying a canvas bag with vegetables in it, somewhat haphazardly arranged. A bunch of parsley was escaping over the top. They stood for a moment in the specific social physics of 2 people who have been avoiding each other, and are now unable to. I haven't seen you on the 8:20, he said. Neutral. Not an accusation. I've had later starts, she said. He nodded. He didn't call her out on it, which was either generosity, or the thing underneath generosity that she recognized as restraint. There's a place nearby, he said. If you haven't had breakfast. She looked at the figs in her hand. She looked at him. I haven't, she said. The restaurant was a small place 2 streets from the market, the kind that existed in Istanbul at the intersection of old neighborhood and long habit, wooden tables worn smooth by years of use, mismatched chairs, the smell of tea and the warm, savory drift of börek, and something slower cooked coming from the kitchen beyond the curtained doorway. The owner greeted Mert by name. A table appeared near the window. They ordered tea. The breakfast arrived in the way Turkish breakfast arrives, not as a meal but as a landscape. White cheese, 2 kinds. Olives, green and black. Sliced tomatoes, cucumbers. A bowl of honey beside a small block of cake. Eggs in a copper pan, still sizzling. fresh bread, 2 varieties of jam, a basket of simit. Leyla looked at it. Something released in her chest, she didn't have a better word for it. "Eat," he said, and poured her tea. She ate. They talked carefully at first, about the market, about the neighborhood, about a new bookshop that had opened near his house. Safe things. The food was warm, and abundant, and honest in the way that only very good simple food can be, and the tea came in the tulip glasses, and the winter light came through the window, and she thought, This is also Istanbul. This belongs to the same city as the palace, and the ferry, and the Bosphorus in the dawn fog. The revisions are going well, he said. The editor was helpful. The call had been good. I'm glad, she said, and meant it. He spread honey on a piece of bread, looked at it, put it on her plate. She didn't protest. He did it with the unconscious ease of someone who has decided, you should have something good, without making a ceremony of the decision. She set down her tea glass. I'm not going to Berlin, she said. He looked up. His expression was very careful. The offer, she said. I'm not going to take it. Leyla. I've decided. She met his eyes. I made the decision 3 weeks ago, honestly. I've just been finishing the process of admitting it. He was quiet. Outside, someone passed with a cart of vegetables, the wheels rattling on the stones. Why? He said. Quietly. The question, not an interrogation, but an invitation. Because leaving would be, she stopped. Because I said once that here I'm only one thing, and that thing is myself. And I've spent the last month trying to find a reason to leave, and the reason I kept coming back to was, she stopped again. Say it, she thought. The reason was that I don't want to, she said. I don't want to leave. And I've spent a very long time treating not wanting to leave as insufficient justification for staying, as if wanting something wasn't enough on its own. She looked at her tea. Turns out it is. He said nothing. She looked up. His face was doing the thing where it went very still, except now she knew what that meant. It meant he was feeling something he hadn't caught up with yet. I should have said something, he said. When you told me about Berlin. I said the reasonable thing, which was the right thing, she said. It was also the cowardly thing, he said. I didn't say what he stopped. Started again. I was afraid of asking you to stay for my sake, when I couldn't tell you what that meant. What I could actually offer you. He looked at the table. An old house on the Asian side. A teaching job. A book that might, or might not amount to anything. Mert, she said. He looked at her. I'm not staying for a house, she said. Or a teaching job. Or a book. She held his gaze. I'm staying, because when I tried to imagine not crossing the Bosphorus every morning, the specific thing I couldn't imagine was, she paused. Not having someone to cross it with. The restaurant moved around them, a family arrived at the next table, the owner called something to the kitchen, the street outside continued its Saturday morning business. And in the middle of it, Mert reached across the table and covered her hand with his, carefully, the way he did things. She turned her hand over. His was warm. They sat like that for a while, with the breakfast spread between them, and the winter light through the windows, and the city outside doing what it always did, which was everything at once, without waiting for anyone to be ready. He nudged the plate of cake toward her. You haven't tried this, he said. She smiled. It started in her eyes before it reached her mouth, the kind of smile she gave when she'd been caught off guard by something genuinely good. She took the bread. She spread the cake. She ate it. He watched her with the expression she would later identify as relief, but in the moment she only knew it as something that made his brown eyes warmer, and his posture ease, as if he'd been carrying something at a slight angle for weeks, and had finally been allowed to set it down. They stayed for another hour. He ate the last of the olives. She stole his tea when hers ran out. He ordered more. She didn't answer her mother's email that weekend. She called instead, which her mother considered an escalation, but which Leyla considered more honest. The conversation was difficult in the specific way that conversations with parents about life choices are difficult, not angry, but weighty, full of concern disguised as practicality and love disguised as logistics. "You're sure?" her mother said. Not a question. "I'm sure," Leyla said. A pause. In the pause, Leyla heard her mother making peace with something. "Your father will be pleased," her mother said finally. And then, "I suppose I understand." This was, from her mother, something very close to a blessing. In March, the publisher confirmed a release date. The book had a title, a cover, a weight in the world beyond the dark green notebook it had lived in for years. Mert brought the cover mock-up to the ferry on a Thursday morning, slightly crumpled from being folded in his jacket pocket. She smoothed it out against her knee. The design was simple, a watercolor of the Bosphorus at an indeterminate hour, light on water, the suggestion of both shores without either being clearly named. She turned it over. On the back, above the brief biography, was the acknowledgements section. They'd let him keep it short, just a paragraph. She read it. She looked up. He was watching her the way he watched things he cared about, without performance, without deflection. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I wanted you to read it," he said, "rather than hear me say it." She looked down at the page again. He hadn't used her name, she didn't need him to. He had written about the ferry, about morning crossings, about the particular courage of the person who convinced him that what he'd built in private could exist in the world. About the difference between the thing you protect and the thing you risk. She gave it back to him. "It's good," she said. "The cover or the acknowledgement?" "Both." He tucked it carefully back into his pocket. The ferry moved through the water. On the European side, the palace was visible, its white facade catching the early spring light the way it always did, with that particular quality of being both ancient and unchanged, the water in front of it moving. She thought, "I have given this tour hundreds of times. I have said these rooms, these windows, this view, and I have forgotten to see it, and then I remembered how, and that is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot." Spring came to Istanbul the way it always did, not gradually but decisively, a morning when you stepped outside, and the air had changed its mind. The Bosphorus shifted color again, back to that nameless green-blue of the better months, and the ferries were fuller, and the chestnuts gave way to fresh corn, and the particular smell of the city rehydrating after winter. Leyla still took the 8:20. It had been months since this required any decision-making. The alarm, the quick coffee, the walk to the pier, she moved through it with the particular ease of a life that has found its own rhythm. She was still figuring out the longer things. Where she would be in 5 years, whether the Üsküdar apartment would be hers permanently or temporarily, what stability looked like when you had chosen it rather than fallen into it. These questions no longer felt urgent. They felt like the background hum of being a person who is actually living her life, rather than waiting to start it. She arrived at the pier 3 minutes early. Mert was already there, in the starboard corner, the notebook open. The notebook was less worn than it had been. He'd started a new one after sending the manuscript, but kept the old one too, she knew, in the way you keep the thing that got you from there to here. The new one had her handwriting in the margin of the first page, "Send it." 2 words. He'd asked her to write them there, which she had found both embarrassing and, privately, perfect. He looked up when she appeared. The slow smile, the one that started behind his eyes, the one she had catalogued without meaning to in the months before she'd known his name. She sat down. He moved his bag. She produced her coffee. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. The ferry moved. There is a particular kind of morning that belongs only to Istanbul. She knew this not because she had read it somewhere, not because she had memorized it for a tour, but because she had lived enough of them to understand what they were. The hour when the Bosphorus holds the light like a secret. The water between 2 continents, neither belonging fully to either, carrying traffic between them since before the city had a name. You could spend years in a place without knowing whether it was yours. You could cross the same stretch of water every morning and mistake familiarity for belonging. The difference, she had learned, was not about time or distance or even the language you thought in when you were tired. The difference was whether you could imagine leaving. She couldn't. She had tried, last winter, to find the version of herself that could, and what she had found instead was the certainty that all her roots had grown downward in the years she hadn't been paying attention, into the old streets of Üsküdar, and the morning crossings, and the particular weight of the city in winter light. She was the daughter of two worlds, and she had found, in a third one, the place where that meant something other than belonging nowhere. It meant belonging to the crossing itself. To the between. The ferry docked at Beşiktaş. They gathered their things. On the pier, before they went in their separate directions, and came back together in the evening, he caught her hand for a moment. Brief. The gesture of someone who knows a thing, and doesn't need to perform it. She squeezed once. Let go. The city opened around them, European, this side, with its trams, and its history, and its impossible hills, and they walked into it, and the morning went on, and somewhere behind them the ferry turned back toward the Asian shore to make the crossing again, as it had been doing, in one form or another, for as long as the city had been a city. The same water. The same distance. Both shores, always in sight.
Thank you so much for listening. If you loved this story, please share it with a friend or leave a like to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for your weekly dose of original audio romance. I'm Elena Maris, and I'll see you in the next story.